Welcome to Revenge Central. I hope you're doing well. Today I will read 10 wild revenge stories. If you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing, and let's get started with Story 1. A woman who'd recently moved into our small suburban neighborhood told a heartbreaking story about her young son having an aggressive form of cancer. Started a crowdfunding campaign that raised almost $31,000 from people across our community over about 4 months. And turned out to have no sick child at all. A fact I only uncovered because I happened to volunteer at the same children's hospital she claimed to be treating him at, and never once saw either of them there despite the specific, detailed appointment schedule she regularly posted. I want to walk through how convincing this was, because I think it's important context for understanding how an entire neighborhood, myself included, ended up genuinely believing and supporting this for months before anyone questioned it. She moved in about 6 months before the campaign started, introduced herself warmly at a neighborhood gathering, and within a couple of months began sharing, gradually and with what felt like genuine reluctance and vulnerability, that her 4-year-old son had been diagnosed with a rare, aggressive leukemia, requiring treatment at a specialized children's hospital about 40 minutes away. Treatment that, she explained, insurance was only partially covering given some complications with a lapse in coverage during a recent job transition. The crowdfunding campaign she started included photos of a young boy in a hospital gown, updates written with specific, plausible-sounding medical terminology, treatment milestones, chemotherapy cycle updates, a rough patch requiring an unplanned hospital admission, the kind of granular, ongoing narrative detail that felt, to anyone reading it, like exactly what a family living through this nightmare would actually be experiencing and sharing. Our neighborhood rallied hard, a genuine, heartfelt outpouring, individual donations ranging from $20 to several hundred from different families, a coordinated meal train for weeks, several fundraising events organized by neighbors entirely independent of the original campaign, a bake sale, a car wash, a raffle at a local business that donated prizes specifically for the cause. I want to be honest that I personally donated, organized part of the meal train rotation, and felt genuinely moved by what I believed this family was going through, which makes what I eventually discovered considerably more unsettling than if I'd simply read about a stranger's scam from a distance. The specific thread that unraveled this began almost accidentally. I volunteer regularly at the same regional children's hospital she'd named as the treatment location, working in a family support role that puts me in contact with a wide range of families going through pediatric cancer treatment. And over the 4 months of her campaign, I never once encountered her or her son. Despite the campaign's updates describing what should have been fairly regular treatment visits to that same specific facility, a coincidence that, on its own, meant very little given how large the hospital is and how many families pass through it. But that started to nag at me as her updates continued describing increasingly specific treatment details. I want to be honest that I did not immediately act on this vague unease, since accusing a grieving mother of fabricating her child's cancer is about as serious an accusation as exists. And I did not want to be the person who destroyed a genuinely struggling family's support network based on nothing more than my own personal not having crossed paths with them at a large hospital. The thing that actually moved me from vague unease to real investigation was a specific detail in one of her updates, describing a particular treatment protocol and a specific attending physician's name at that hospital. A detail I recognized as being inconsistent with how that hospital's actual oncology department was structured, since I happened to know, through my volunteer role, the actual physicians on that specific specialized team, and the name she'd mentioned did not correspond to anyone currently on staff there. That specific, checkable factual inconsistency, rather than any vague feeling, is what pushed me to actually look deeper, rather than simply continuing to quietly wonder. I want to describe the specific care I tried to take and how I approached this next step, since I was acutely aware of how much damage a wrong accusation could do, both to her if I was mistaken, and to my own standing in a neighborhood that had rallied so warmly and publicly around this cause. I reached out, carefully and without accusation, to a colleague in the hospital's actual patient services administration, someone with legitimate reason to access general information about whether a specific patient, matching the description and rough timeline she'd provided, had ever actually been treated there, framing my question around a general concern about crowdfunding verification rather than a direct accusation against a specific named individual. Given legitimate patient privacy protections, I did not expect and did not receive any specific confirmation or denial regarding an actual named patient, but my colleague did mention, in a way that told me something important without violating any specific privacy boundary, that the hospital's development office periodically deals with exactly this kind of situation. Individuals falsely claiming an affiliation with the hospital's actual treatment programs as part of fundraising efforts entirely disconnected from any real patient relationship, and specifically encouraged me to report the campaign directly to the hospital's own foundation office if I had genuine, specific concerns, since they maintain a formal process for exactly this kind of verification request when a crowdfunding campaign explicitly names their facility. I submitted that report, along with the specific, inconsistent physician name detail and the general campaign information, to the Hospital Foundation's office, and separately, given the scale of money already raised across our community, consulted with a couple of trusted neighbors, the ones who'd been most centrally involved in organizing the community fundraising response, sharing my specific concerns privately rather than posting anything publicly before we had more clarity, since I wanted any next steps to be careful and proportionate, rather than triggering a public pile-on based on suspicion alone. The Hospital Foundation's office, after their own internal review process, which took a couple of weeks, came back to me with confirmation, carefully worded to respect their own institutional privacy obligations, but clear enough in its substance, that they had no record of any patient matching the description and treatment timeline associated with this specific crowdfunding campaign ever having been treated at their facility, a finding significant enough on its own that they indicated they were prepared to formally notify the crowdfunding platform directly, since platforms generally do have a process for handling verified reports of fraudulent campaigns misrepresenting an affiliation with a specific named medical institution. Once we had that institutional confirmation, our small group of neighbors approached the situation directly. Though I want to be honest, this was one of the more uncomfortable conversations any of us have ever had to initiate, requesting a meeting under the framing of wanting to better understand how we could continue supporting her family going forward, without immediately revealing the full extent of what we'd already confirmed. She did not maintain the story once directly and specifically confronted with the hospital's confirmation that no patient matching her description had ever been treated there, and, notably, did not have a functioning explanation ready for that specific gap, admitting, eventually, that there was no actual cancer diagnosis at all, and offering an explanation involving genuine, real financial desperation from an unrelated situation that she'd apparently decided, at some point, to address through fabricating an illness narrative specifically because she believed, correctly as it turned out for a while, that a community would respond to a sick child's story with a level of generosity and speed that an honest account of ordinary financial hardship would likely never generate at anywhere near the same scale. I want to be honest that this specific explanation, while it added a layer of understandable human context to an otherwise purely predatory-sounding scheme, did nothing to change the fact that she had knowingly fabricated a fictional cancer diagnosis for a real child, her actual son, who, we confirmed, was healthy and had never been ill at all, using his real photograph and, presumably in some emotional sense, his real childhood as the emotional centerpiece of a scheme that extracted real money from real neighbors who genuinely believed they were helping a family through the worst thing imaginable. We reported the full situation, once confirmed, to the crowdfunding platform directly, which does have formal fraud investigation and fund freezing procedures for exactly this kind of confirmed misrepresentation, resulting in the campaign being taken down and any remaining, undistributed funds frozen, though I want to be honest that a significant portion of the roughly $31,000 raised had already been withdrawn and spent by that point, meaning full recovery for the community was never realistically achievable through the platform's own fraud process alone. Several of the more significantly affected donors, coordinating together once the situation became known, pursued a police report specifically framing this as fraud by false pretenses, given the deliberate, sustained fabrication of a medical crisis specifically designed to induce financial donations, which is a real, chargeable criminal offense in most jurisdictions distinct from ordinary civil fraud, resulting eventually in criminal charges being filed. Though I want to note that as of this writing, the case remains in process, moving through our local court system at what feels, to those of us waiting for some resolution, like a genuinely frustrating pace given how clear-cut the underlying facts turned out to be once confirmed. She and her family moved out of the neighborhood within about a month of the confrontation, which I understand, given the completely, understandably shattered trust that no amount of explanation could realistically repair within a community that had rallied around her so completely and personally. The thing I keep sitting with, more than any specific financial or legal outcome, is how completely this experience has changed how instinctively I now respond to crowdfunding appeals of any kind, even ones I have no specific reason to doubt. A wariness I genuinely wish I didn't have to carry, given how many of these campaigns are, I have to believe, entirely legitimate and represent real people in real, desperate need of exactly the kind of community support that ours so readily provided. If there's a practical lesson here, beyond simply being more cautious, it's that if a crowdfunding campaign specifically names a particular hospital, treatment facility, or medical provider, that specific institution generally does have some kind of formal verification or fraud reporting process available if you have genuine, specific reason for concern, a process that, in my case, took only a couple of weeks to definitively confirm what months of vague unease alone never would have resolved on its own. Story 2. I signed up with an online telehealth weight loss clinic that promised the same medication everyone was talking about at a fraction of the price a real pharmacy quoted me. And after 3 months of injections that did essentially nothing, followed by a genuinely frightening reaction to whatever was actually in the vial, I found out through my own insistence on lab testing that what I'd been injecting was not the medication I'd been prescribed at all, just an unregulated compounded substance with no reliable dosing, and, in my specific batch, a contamination issue that a state pharmacy board eventually confirmed across multiple patients. I want to explain the landscape a little, since I think it matters for understanding how I ended up here despite considering myself a reasonably careful consumer. The specific injectable medication in question had become so popular that legitimate pharmacy supply genuinely could not keep up with demand for a while, creating real shortages, and during that shortage window, a wave of telehealth companies and compounding pharmacies emerged, offering versions of the medication at prices dramatically below what insurance-billed retail pharmacies were charging. Some of them entirely legitimate, operating within specific, narrow regulatory allowances that exist for compounding pharmacies to produce alternatives during a documented drug shortage, and some of them, it turns out, considerably less legitimate, using that same shortage confusion as cover to sell products with loose or non-existent quality control. The clinic I used had a professional website, a licensed physician's name attached to a brief video consultation process, and a subscription model shipping a monthly supply directly to my door, priced at less than a third of what my own regular pharmacy had quoted me for the brand name version, a gap I attributed, at the time, entirely to the compounding process cutting out brand name markup, which is a real and often legitimate cost difference for compounded medications generally. I want to be honest that the medication did essentially nothing for me over 3 months. No meaningful appetite change, no weight loss beyond what I'd expect from the general lifestyle changes I was also making, which frustrated me, but which I initially chalked up to my own body's individual response rather than anything wrong with the product itself, since medication response genuinely does vary considerably between people. The moment that actually alarmed me happened during month 4, a new shipment that looked slightly different from previous ones, a faint discoloration in the liquid that hadn't been present in earlier vials, and within about 20 minutes of that specific injection, a reaction unlike anything I'd experienced with the previous 3 months of shipments, significant swelling and redness at the injection site, along with a genuinely frightening wave of dizziness and nausea that sent me to urgent care. The urgent care physician treated the acute reaction and, notably, asked pointed questions about exactly where I'd obtained the medication, mentioning that he'd seen an uptick in similar reactions over recent months, connected specifically to telehealth compounded versions of this medication category, and recommended I have the actual remaining product in that specific vial tested, rather than simply assuming it was a one-off bad reaction, since if the product itself was compromised, continuing to use remaining vials from the same batch could pose ongoing risk. I want to describe how genuinely difficult it was to actually get that testing done, since this is not something an individual consumer can simply walk into any lab and request without some guidance. I called our state's pharmacy board directly, explained the reaction and my suspicion about the product itself, and was directed to file a formal adverse event report, both with the state board and with the FDA's own adverse event reporting system, which exists specifically for exactly this kind of situation: a consumer experiencing a reaction from a medication whose actual composition or purity is in question. The state pharmacy board, once I filed that report and specifically requested it, arranged for the remaining product in my vial to be collected and tested through their own investigative process. A process that took several weeks to produce results, but that I want to note moved considerably faster and with more institutional weight behind it than anything I could have arranged independently as a single consumer trying to get an unknown liquid analyzed on my own. The testing results, once they came back, confirmed two separate problems that, taken together, explained both my lack of results over the first 3 months and my acute reaction in month 4. First, the concentration of active medication in the tested vials was significantly below what the product had been labeled and priced as containing, in some cases barely a fraction of the labeled dose, which explained why I'd experienced essentially no therapeutic effect over those first months, despite paying for and injecting what I believed was a properly dosed medication. Second, and more seriously, the specific batch connected to my reaction showed evidence of microbial contamination, consistent with a compounding process that had not followed proper sterile technique, which was the direct cause of my acute reaction and posed a genuinely serious infection risk beyond just the discomfort I'd already experienced. I want to be clear that this specific combination, underdosed product for months followed by a contaminated batch, is not, as far as I understand from what the pharmacy board investigator explained to me, representative of every telehealth compounded weight loss product. Plenty of legitimate compounding pharmacies operating within proper regulatory bounds produce consistent, correctly dosed, sterile product throughout a shortage period. What had apparently happened with my specific clinic was that they were sourcing their compounded product from an unlicensed or improperly licensed supplier operating outside the specific narrow legal framework that allows compounding during a documented shortage, cutting corners on both quality control testing and proper sterile compounding technique, specifically to maximize volume and profit margin during a period of extremely high demand. Once the pharmacy board's testing confirmed the contamination and underdosing, their investigation expanded considerably beyond just my individual complaint, since a confirmed contamination finding in a product being shipped to patients across potentially many states triggers a broader regulatory response than an individual consumer complaint alone typically would. The board coordinated with the FDA, given that this specific compounding and distribution operation was shipping across state lines, which brings federal jurisdiction into play beyond just our state board's own authority. And the investigation, once it expanded, identified the actual source of the product as an unlicensed compounding operation that had been supplying multiple different telehealth clinic fronts, not just the one I'd used, each presenting as an independent legitimate business, but all sourcing product from the same underlying unlicensed source. I want to describe the moment I learned how many other people had been affected, since it reframed my entire understanding of what had happened to me from an unfortunate individual bad experience into something considerably larger and more troubling. The investigator handling my case, once she was able to share general, non-identifying information about the scope of the broader investigation, indicated that adverse event reports connected to product traceable to this same source had been filed by patients across a meaningful number of states, with reactions ranging from mine, acute but ultimately resolved with treatment, to considerably more serious hospitalizations in a smaller number of other cases. The regulatory action that followed included the FDA issuing a public warning specifically identifying the unlicensed compounding source and the network of telehealth clinics distributing its product, along with import and distribution restrictions aimed at cutting off the supply chain, and separately, several of the telehealth clinic fronts, including the one I'd used, ceased operations entirely once their name became publicly associated with the FDA warning and the underlying contamination findings, their websites going offline within weeks of the warning being issued. I pursued a refund for my own subscription payments through a credit card dispute, citing the confirmed contamination and underdosing findings as documented by the state pharmacy board's own testing, which my card issuer honored without much resistance, given how clear and official that supporting documentation was. I also consulted an attorney regarding the medical costs from my urgent care visit and the broader harm from months of paying for a product that had never actually contained a therapeutic dose in the first place. A case that, given the clinic's abrupt closure once the broader investigation became public, ultimately proceeded against them, more as a claim within whatever remaining assets or insurance coverage existed than as a fully contested lawsuit, recovering a partial settlement covering my direct medical costs and a portion of my subscription payments. Though I want to be honest, that full recovery proved difficult once the underlying business had effectively evaporated in the wake of the regulatory action. The thing I keep returning to, months removed from this now, is how completely indistinguishable the clinic's marketing and consultation process felt from what I imagine a legitimate telehealth compounding pharmacy operation looks like from a consumer's perspective. A real-seeming physician video consultation, professional packaging, a subscription model that felt, in every visible respect, like the kind of modern healthcare delivery model that legitimately does exist and does serve people well in plenty of other contexts. Nothing about the actual consumer-facing experience gave any visible indication that the underlying product sourcing was operating so far outside acceptable manufacturing standards. If you're using any telehealth service for a compounded version of a medication, particularly one currently experiencing a supply shortage that's created a wave of alternative providers, I would strongly encourage specifically asking, directly and in writing, what licensed compounding pharmacy is actually producing the product. A detail a legitimate telehealth clinic should be able and willing to disclose clearly, and independently verifying that specific pharmacy's licensing status through your state's pharmacy board website. A check that takes only a few minutes and that, had I known to do it before my first shipment ever arrived, would very likely have raised enough questions to keep me from ever injecting a single dose of a product that, as it turned out, was never reliably delivering the medication I believed I was paying for at all. Story 3. My mother fell in her kitchen and pressed the button on the medical alert pendant she'd been paying $39 a month for over 3 years, and nothing happened. No response, no dispatch, nothing. Because the monitoring company behind that device had quietly stopped operating its actual response center months earlier, while continuing to charge her credit card automatically every single month for a service that, we discovered afterward, had not actually been functioning at all during that entire window. I want to walk through how my mother ended up lying on her kitchen floor for close to 2 hours before a neighbor happened to notice her mail piling up and came to check on her, because understanding the specific gap between what she believed she had and what she actually had is the entire point of this story. My mother, 79, lives independently, sharp and capable in daily life, but understandably cautious about the risk of a fall, given some balance issues that had developed over the past couple of years. We'd set her up with a medical alert pendant specifically because it gave the whole family real peace of mind, a device worn around her neck or wrist that, when pressed, was supposed to connect her immediately to a live monitoring center staffed around the clock, who would assess the situation and dispatch emergency services or contact a family member as needed. She fell reaching for something on a low shelf, twisted her ankle badly enough that she couldn't get up on her own, and pressed the button exactly as she'd been trained to do, expecting the reassuring voice of a monitoring center representative to come through the device's speaker within moments. Nothing came. She pressed it again. Still nothing. She told me afterward that she sat there, confused and increasingly frightened, genuinely believing for a while that something must be wrong with her hearing, or the device's speaker specifically, rather than considering the possibility that the entire monitoring service behind the device might simply not exist anymore. A neighbor, thankfully, noticed her newspaper and mail accumulating by late afternoon, something my mother had specifically asked him to watch for as an informal backup check precisely because she was security conscious about exactly this kind of scenario, and let himself in with the spare key she'd given him, finding her on the kitchen floor after close to 2 hours. She was, thankfully, not seriously injured beyond the ankle sprain and some understandable shock and dehydration from the extended time on the floor, but I want to be honest, that the what if of that afternoon, what if the neighbor hadn't happened to notice the mail, what if the fall had been more serious, has stayed with our entire family in a way that's hard to fully articulate, precisely because the entire point of that device was to remove exactly this kind of dependence on a neighbor's casual attentiveness. Once she was safely checked out at the hospital, I turned to figuring out what had actually gone wrong with the device itself, calling the company's customer service line, which connected to a message stating the number was no longer in service, a discovery that, on its own, told me most of what I needed to know before any further investigation, since a legitimate, currently operating medical monitoring company does not have a disconnected customer service line. I checked my mother's bank statements next and confirmed that the monthly $39 charge had continued to process automatically every single month, including the most recent charge just 11 days before her fall, meaning whatever had happened to this company's actual monitoring operations, their billing system had continued functioning perfectly well the entire time, charging customers for a service that apparently was not being delivered at all. I want to describe what I actually found once I dug into this more broadly, because I think it matters for understanding how something this serious can happen to a genuinely careful, well-intentioned family without anyone catching it sooner. The company had apparently gone through some kind of corporate restructuring or acquisition roughly 8 months before my mother's fall, a transition that, as far as I could piece together from public business filings and some determined searching, resulted in the company's actual physical monitoring center, the facility with live operators actually staffing the emergency response line, being shut down or transferred in a way that was never clearly or directly communicated to existing customers, while a separate billing and customer acquisition arm of the business, or possibly an entirely different entity that had acquired just the billing relationships and customer list, continued collecting monthly payments from existing subscribers who had no reason to believe anything had changed. I want to note something important here that a consumer attorney I eventually consulted explained clearly, which is that this specific pattern, a service business quietly discontinuing actual service delivery while continuing automated billing, sometimes happens through outright deliberate fraud, and sometimes happens through a genuinely chaotic corporate wind-down or bankruptcy proceeding where automated billing systems simply keep running because nobody with the authority or responsibility to shut them down properly did so before the underlying service infrastructure was dismantled, meaning the actual legal characterization, fraud versus gross negligence during a business failure, matters enormously for what kind of accountability is realistically achievable and often takes real investigation to sort out. My first priority, honestly, was less about pursuing this company and more about immediately getting my mother onto an actual functioning medical alert service, which we did within days, choosing this time a company with a physical monitoring center address I specifically verified, a live person I spoke with directly during setup, and a habit, going forward, of testing the device's actual connection to a live operator on a specific recurring schedule, rather than assuming, the way we'd reasonably assumed for over 3 years, that a service working correctly at setup would simply continue working correctly indefinitely, without any need for periodic verification. Once that immediate safety need was addressed, I turned to pursuing accountability for what had happened. I filed a complaint with our state's Attorney General Consumer Protection Division, specifically documenting the continued automatic billing for a service that had demonstrably not functioned during my mother's actual emergency, along with a formal complaint with the Federal Trade Commission, since billing for a service not actually being rendered, particularly one specifically marketed around emergency safety response for elderly and vulnerable consumers, is exactly the kind of consumer protection violation these agencies take seriously, especially given the specific vulnerability of the customer base this entire product category serves. I also disputed the credit card charges directly, going back as far as our card issuer's dispute window allowed, on the basis of services paid for but never rendered, providing the hospital records from my mother's fall and the disconnected customer service number as supporting documentation, which resulted in a reversal of the specific charges within that dispute window, though, as with several similar situations I've since learned other families dealing with this same or similar defunct monitoring companies have experienced, charges from further back than the dispute window allowed were simply unrecoverable through that specific path. The Attorney General's investigation, once opened, uncovered something that genuinely disturbed me once I learned about it, which was that my mother's situation was far from isolated, with several other elderly customers across our state alone having filed similar complaints once the investigation prompted some local news coverage that brought the situation to broader public attention, each describing the same core pattern: continued automatic billing for a monitoring service that, upon actual emergency use, connected to nothing at all. That broader pattern, once documented across multiple complainants, gave the investigation considerably more weight than my mother's individual case alone would have carried, and resulted in the state pursuing action against whatever remaining corporate entity could still be identified and held responsible for the billing operation. Though I want to be honest that given how thoroughly the underlying monitoring business itself appeared to have already wound down or dissolved by the time any of this reached a formal resolution, the practical financial recovery available through that broader regulatory action was limited, resulting mostly in a cessation of any further billing activity and a public warning notice rather than any significant financial restitution reaching individual affected families like ours. I want to spend the last part of this on the practical safety lesson, because I think it matters more than any of the financial or regulatory details. If you have an elderly parent or any loved one relying on any kind of emergency medical alert device, I would strongly encourage setting up a recurring test, not an occasional, casual, "does this still work?" thought that gets deprioritized against everything else life demands attention for, but an actual, calendared, recurring test, pressing the button on a schedule specifically to confirm live, active connection to an actual human monitoring operator. Something the device manufacturer or monitoring company itself can typically walk you through doing safely, without triggering an actual emergency dispatch. We test my mother's new device on the 1st of every month now, a habit that costs about 2 minutes and that, had it existed with her previous device, would have caught this company's silent failure the very first month it happened, rather than leaving her lying on her kitchen floor for 2 hours believing help was on the way when it never actually was. Story 4. I paid $1,100 for an extremely limited release sneaker through what looked like a well-established resale account, with hundreds of positive transactions, received a box that had the right shoebox, the right size sticker, and the right accessories, but contained an obviously different, far cheaper pair of sneakers inside. And getting my money back required outmaneuvering a seller who had clearly built an entire reputation specifically to run this exact switch on a high-value item once enough trust had accumulated. I want to explain the resale sneaker market a little, since I think understanding the specific trust mechanisms that make this market function is necessary for understanding how this particular scam worked. Limited sneaker releases routinely resell for many multiples of retail price, and the entire secondary market runs on peer-to-peer trust, built through transaction history, seller ratings, and community reputation within specific platforms and forums dedicated to this hobby, since there's no equivalent to a manufacturer's warranty or return policy once you're buying a resold, limited item from an individual seller rather than an authorized retailer. The seller I bought from, I'll call him by his platform handle rather than any real name since I never learned his actual identity with certainty, had an account with several years of history and what appeared to be a genuinely strong track record, positive feedback across dozens of prior transactions, active participation in community discussion threads about upcoming releases, the kind of established presence that, within this specific hobby community, functions as a meaningful trust signal, that most buyers, myself included, rely on heavily, given the complete absence of any other institutional verification for this kind of transaction. I want to describe the specific care I did take before this purchase, since I don't want to present myself as someone who ignored obvious red flags. I checked his feedback history carefully, engaged with him directly in messages before committing to the purchase, and paid through the platform's own integrated payment system rather than any outside payment method, specifically because that platform's payment system includes at least some baseline buyer protection and dispute mechanism, unlike a direct peer-to-peer payment app transfer that would have left me with essentially no recourse at all. The box, when it arrived, looked completely legitimate from the outside, the correct manufacturer box for this specific release, a size sticker matching what I'd ordered, and the specific accessory items, extra laces and a dust bag, that are typically included with this particular release. It was only opening the box and actually looking at the shoes themselves that revealed the problem, an entirely different, considerably more common and less expensive model, in a similar general colorway, but unmistakably not the specific limited release I'd paid for, clearly identifiable by anyone with even moderate familiarity with this specific shoe's actual design details. I want to describe the specific sinking realization of that moment, understanding that I had not simply received a mistaken shipment. An honest mix-up would typically involve either the wrong size of the correct shoe or some other plausible logistics error, but a completely different, cheaper product placed inside an authentic-looking box for the expensive release, which meant this had to be a deliberate substitution rather than any kind of innocent fulfillment mistake. I photographed everything immediately, the box exterior showing the correct labeling, the actual shoes showing clearly that they did not match, side-by-side comparison shots against reference photos of the actual release I'd paid for, and the specific model markings visible on the substituted shoes themselves, confirming exactly what had been sent instead. I want to emphasize how important this immediate, thorough documentation turned out to be for everything that followed, since a dispute process for an item like this depends heavily on being able to clearly demonstrate the discrepancy rather than simply asserting it. I opened a dispute through the platform's buyer protection process immediately, providing all of that photo documentation, and want to walk through how the seller responded, since it reveals something about how deliberate and prepared this scheme likely was. He claimed, when the platform reached out to him as part of the dispute process, that he had shipped the correct item and suggested I must have made an error, or was attempting to defraud him by claiming a switch that never happened. A defense that, on its face, put the dispute into a genuine he said, she said situation that platform mediators generally have to weigh carefully rather than automatically siding with either party. What actually tipped the resolution in my favor? And this is the detail I think matters most for anyone facing a similar situation, was the platform's own shipping weight verification system, a feature I did not know existed before this happened, but that turned out to be exactly the kind of objective, third-party evidence that made the difference. The platform, as part of their authentication and buyer protection process for high-value items specifically, records the verified weight of the package at the point of shipment through their own logistics partnership, and separately maintains, in their own product database, the standard verified weight for legitimate pairs of the specific release I'd ordered, since sneaker weight can actually vary meaningfully between different models even when overall box dimensions look similar. When the platform's dispute team compared the recorded shipment weight against both the expected weight for the legitimate release and the actual weight of the substituted shoes I'd received, which I provided by weighing the package myself on a kitchen scale and submitting that measurement alongside my photos, the numbers were significantly inconsistent with the legitimate release's known weight and, notably, consistent instead with the weight profile of the cheaper substituted model I'd actually received, providing objective, third-party corroboration that went well beyond simply my word against the seller's denial. That weight discrepancy evidence, combined with my detailed photo documentation, was enough for the platform's dispute resolution team to rule in my favor, reversing the transaction and refunding my full $1,100, along with suspending the seller's account pending further review given the seriousness and clear deliberateness of the substitution once their own internal evidence corroborated my claim rather than his denial. I want to describe what happened next, because it moved beyond just my individual dispute once the platform's investigation into this seller's account expanded. Once flagged for this kind of serious violation, platforms in this specific resale category generally review a seller's recent broader transaction history, rather than treating a confirmed violation as an isolated incident. And I later learned, through a community forum where sellers and buyers in this hobby space actively discuss exactly this kind of dispute resolution outcome, that at least 2 other buyers had filed similar complaints against the same seller account within a similar recent window, describing the identical pattern: a legitimate-looking box and accessories with a substituted, cheaper shoe inside, though neither of those other buyers had documented their case as thoroughly, with photos and independent weight verification as I had, meaning their disputes had apparently been more difficult to resolve definitively in their favor without that additional objective evidence. Once that broader pattern became visible to the platform through the combination of my well-documented case and these other similar complaints, the seller's account was permanently banned from the platform entirely, a genuinely meaningful consequence within this specific hobby community, since rebuilding an equivalent trusted reputation and transaction history from scratch under a new identity, while certainly possible, represents a real setback for someone who had apparently invested years building the specific credibility that made this exact scam viable in the first place. I want to spend the last part of this on the practical lesson, since I think it's genuinely useful for anyone buying high-value collectible or limited items through any peer-to-peer resale platform. First, always pay through the platform's own integrated, protected payment system rather than any outside payment method a seller might suggest as an alternative, since that integrated system, in my case, was the entire mechanism that made a meaningful dispute resolution process possible at all. Second, photograph everything immediately upon opening any high-value package, the exterior box, the contents, and the specific item itself, compared against reference images, before you do anything else with the package, since that immediate documentation, time-stamped and thorough, is exactly what a fair dispute resolution process depends on. And third, if the platform you're using offers any kind of shipment weight verification or similar objective authentication feature for high-value items, understand that it exists and how to reference it in a dispute, since in my case, that single piece of independently recorded objective data was very likely the deciding factor that turned what could have been an unresolvable he said, she said dispute into a clear, evidence-based resolution firmly in my favor. Story 5. I used the same grocery delivery shopper through an app for almost a year, tipped generously every single time, and eventually discovered, through nothing more than finally comparing my actual receipts against what got delivered, that she had been systematically substituting cheaper store-brand items for name-brand products I'd paid full price for, while separately marking a small number of items as out of stock and refunding me for them, even though the receipt showed she'd actually purchased them, apparently keeping those specific items for herself. I want to explain how this went unnoticed for as long as it did, since I think it matters for understanding why this specific kind of theft is genuinely difficult for most people to catch, even when they're generally attentive customers. Grocery delivery through these apps typically works by having the shopper walk through the actual store, select and purchase items on your behalf, and deliver them, with the app showing you a real-time updating list and, at the end, a final receipt reflecting what was actually purchased. For most orders, I'd glance at the delivered items, confirm nothing was obviously missing, and move on with my day, never actually pulling up the itemized receipt and comparing it line by line against both what I'd ordered and what physically arrived in my bags. The specific pattern, once I finally did start comparing things carefully, involved 2 distinct forms of what amounted to theft happening simultaneously. First, on a meaningful number of orders, name-brand products I'd specifically selected and that the receipt showed as purchased at the name-brand price would arrive as the store's generic equivalent instead, A swap that, if you're not specifically checking labels against your original order and receipt together, is genuinely easy to miss, especially for products where the packaging looks broadly similar or where you simply trust that what arrived matches what you paid for without double-checking. Second, and this took me considerably longer to piece together, a small number of specific items on nearly every order, generally more expensive specialty products, a particular imported cheese, a specific cut of meat, would show up in the app as marked out of stock, with an automatic refund processed for that item, while the receipt, which I only started actually pulling up and reading in full detail after noticing the brand substitution pattern, showed those exact items as having actually been purchased and charged to my card before the refund was processed, meaning the actual purchase had happened, the item had been paid for, and then marked unavailable and refunded after the fact. A sequence that only makes sense if the physical item itself was never actually placed in my delivery bag at all. I want to describe the specific moment this clicked into place as a deliberate pattern rather than an occasional mistake, since I think that distinction matters enormously for how I approached what came next. I'd started keeping receipts, specifically after noticing the brand substitution issue on a couple of orders, initially assuming it was simply an honest mistake or the app's substitution settings being triggered incorrectly, since these platforms do have a legitimate substitution feature for genuinely out-of-stock items that shoppers use appropriately all the time. But once I had about 6 weeks of saved receipts to actually compare side by side, the pattern was unmistakably specific and consistent. The same 2 or 3 particular expensive items, marked out of stock and refunded on almost every single order, despite the receipt showing they'd been purchased, while brand substitutions, on cheaper, more common items, happened far more broadly across the order, but always in the same direction: name brand charged, store brand delivered. I want to be fair and note that I did, briefly, consider whether this could reflect some kind of systemic issue with the app itself, a software glitch causing this pattern across all shoppers rather than something specific to this one person. So, before assuming deliberate theft on her part specifically, I checked with a friend who used the same app in a different city with a different regular shopper, comparing her receipts against her own deliveries over a similar window, and found no comparable pattern at all in her orders, brand substitutions matching what actually got delivered, and no pattern of expensive items being marked out of stock and refunded after purchase. That comparison gave me real confidence this was specific to my particular shopper's behavior, rather than any broader systemic app issue. I reported this directly through the app's own support channel first, providing the specific saved receipts alongside photos of what had actually arrived for several recent orders, clearly showing the brand mismatch, along with the specific pattern of expensive items marked out of stock and refunded despite the receipt showing they'd been purchased and charged. The app's customer support process, once I laid out this documented pattern rather than a single vague complaint, escalated the issue internally, and within about a week, I received confirmation that they had conducted their own investigation, including reviewing the shopper's account activity across a broader set of customers beyond just my own orders, and had identified a similar pattern affecting other customers she'd shopped for as well, not just me. I want to describe what the company shared with me about the scope of this, to the extent they were able to, given their own customer privacy considerations regarding other affected users, which was that this specific shopper's account showed a pattern across a meaningful number of her deliveries, spanning several months, involving both the brand substitution pattern and the purchased then refunded item pattern I documented, affecting what they described as a number of different customers beyond just myself, suggesting this had been a sustained, deliberate practice rather than anything isolated to my specific account, or a misunderstanding about my particular preferences. The company deactivated her account entirely once their internal investigation confirmed the pattern and issued me a full refund covering the accumulated difference between what I'd paid for name brand items that had actually arrived as store brand substitutes, along with a refund for the specific pattern of items purchased, charged, and then marked out of stock without ever actually being delivered, calculated across the full window of my saved receipts and cross-referenced against my delivery records, coming to just under $400 once fully tallied across several months of affected orders. I want to be honest that $400, spread out gradually across many individual orders over months, is not a dramatic sum in any single instance, which I think is exactly why this specific kind of theft is so sustainable for someone willing to do it repeatedly, and why it likely goes undetected far more often than it gets caught. Since no single order's discrepancy feels significant enough on its own to trigger real scrutiny, and it's only the accumulated pattern across many orders, compared carefully rather than glanced at individually, that reveals the actual scale of what's happening. I also filed a report with our state's Consumer Protection Division, less because I expected any significant individual action on a $400 consumer complaint specifically, and more because I wanted a formal record documenting this specific pattern in case it connected to other complaints against the same individual or contributed to the state's broader awareness of how this kind of theft can operate within gig delivery platforms generally, a category of consumer harm that I suspect is considerably underreported, given how modest any individual instance typically is, relative to the effort required to actually notice and document it properly. I want to spend the last part of this on the practical habit I've built since, because I think it's genuinely useful for anyone using any kind of grocery or item delivery service regularly. I now pull up the complete, itemized receipt for every single order, not just glance at the delivered bags, and specifically check two things: whether any items show as purchased on the receipt that did not actually arrive in my delivery, and whether any items that did arrive differ from what the receipt shows as purchased, brand, size, or specific product variation, a check that takes maybe 3 or 4 minutes per order, and that, had I been doing it from the very first order with this specific shopper rather than waiting nearly a year to start comparing things carefully, would have caught this pattern within the first month rather than letting it continue, undetected, across what turned out to be a meaningful number of orders and, apparently, a meaningful number of other affected customers besides myself. If you use any grocery or item delivery service regularly with the same recurring shopper or driver, I'd encourage building this same simple receipt comparison habit, not out of any specific suspicion of the person currently shopping for you. Most delivery workers in this space are, I have to believe, entirely honest, doing genuinely difficult, underpaid work well, but simply because this specific kind of theft, small, incremental, spread across many orders and many customers, depends entirely on nobody ever actually comparing the receipt against the delivery, closely enough to notice a pattern that, once you actually look, turns out to be remarkably easy to spot. Story 6. I found what looked like a perfect puppy listing online. A specific rare-colored French bulldog from a breeder, with a professional website, health testing certificates, and photos of a whole litter, paid a $900 deposit to hold the specific puppy I'd fallen in love with, and after weeks of increasingly implausible shipping delays, discovered the entire breeder website, the photos, the health certificates, and the litter itself had never actually existed at all. A completely fabricated operation targeting people specifically searching for a hard-to-find, expensive breed. I want to explain why this specific breed and price point mattered to how convincingly this scam operated, since I think the mechanism depends heavily on exploiting exactly the kind of desperate, competitive search that a rare or trendy breed at a specific price point creates. The specific color pattern I was looking for is genuinely rare and expensive, commanding prices well above a standard puppy of that breed, meaning finding a listing at a price that felt reasonable relative to that specific rarity, rather than suspiciously cheap, made the whole thing feel like a legitimate, if lucky, find, rather than an obvious too-good-to-be-true scenario. The website itself was professional, presented as a small, dedicated hobby breeder rather than a large commercial operation, which matched exactly the kind of breeder profile responsible buyers are generally advised to look for, complete with photos of what were presented as the breeding parents, health testing documentation for genetic conditions common to the breed, and a specific litter page showing individual puppies with names, weights, and available dates, including the specific puppy I ultimately fell for, pictured repeatedly across what appeared to be several weeks of growth photos. I want to be honest about the specific due diligence I did believe I was doing at the time, since I did not consider myself a naive buyer walking into this blindly. I video called with the person presenting as the breeder before sending any money, saw what appeared to be a puppy matching the listing photos during that call, though in a dimly lit, cluttered background that I now understand, having researched this more since, is a specific tactic used to make video verification difficult without appearing obviously suspicious in the moment, since a legitimate breeder showing you their actual home and actual puppies would generally have no reason to keep the visual environment quite that obscured. I paid the $900 deposit through a payment app, at the seller's specific request, framed as their preferred method since it avoided certain processing fees compared to other options, a detail that, in hindsight, mattered enormously for what recovery options I ultimately had available, since payment apps, unlike credit cards, generally offer minimal buyer protection for this kind of transaction, especially once funds have already been accepted and moved by the receiving account. The shipping delays began about a week before the puppy was supposed to be ready for pickup or delivery, framed initially as a routine health check requirement before travel. Then, as more time passed, escalating into a series of increasingly elaborate excuses, a required specialized travel crate that needed to be purchased separately, an additional fee for a supposedly required climate-controlled shipping service given the specific season, each excuse arriving with a request for an additional payment to resolve whatever obstacle had supposedly arisen. A classic escalating fee pattern that I recognize now as an extremely common structure in this specific category of scam, though I did not recognize it in the moment, having already emotionally committed to a puppy I believed was real and waiting for me. I did not send any of the additional requested payments, having grown suspicious enough by that point to pause rather than continue escalating my financial exposure, but I had already lost the original $900 deposit and was, at that point, trying to figure out whether there was any realistic path to either getting that money back or, more importantly to me emotionally at that point, confirming definitively whether any real puppy existed at all or whether I'd been fully and completely scammed from the very beginning. I want to describe the specific research process that ultimately confirmed this was a complete fabrication, since I think the method matters for anyone else finding themselves in a similar situation. I took the specific photos from the breeder's website, the parent dogs, and several of the individual puppy photos, and ran them through a reverse image search, finding, within minutes, that these exact photos appeared on several other completely unrelated websites, some legitimate breeder sites in entirely different states with no connection to the seller I'd been dealing with, and, more damningly, on at least 2 other clearly fraudulent listing sites using different breeder names and different contact information entirely, meaning these photos had been stolen from legitimate sources and were being recycled across multiple fake breeder website templates run by what was very likely the same underlying scam operation, targeting buyers across many different specific breeds and price points simultaneously. That reverse image search confirmation, showing the same specific puppies supposedly being sold simultaneously under completely different breeder identities in different states, was the moment any remaining hope I'd been holding on to that this might somehow still be a real, if disorganized, situation completely evaporated. I want to walk through what I actually did once I had this confirmation, since I think the specific reporting pathways matter for anyone trying to pursue accountability in this exact scenario. I filed a report with the Federal Trade Commission, specifically framing this as an online pet sale scam involving stolen imagery and a fabricated breeding operation, since the FTC does track and periodically take enforcement action against exactly this category of fraud, which has become common enough that pet sale scams specifically are tracked as their own recognized fraud category within the agency's broader consumer complaint system. I also reported the specific website hosting the fake breeder listing to the domain registrar and hosting provider, since most hosting providers do have terms of service prohibiting fraudulent commercial activity and will take down a site once presented with clear evidence. In my case, the reverse image search results showing the same photos being used across multiple fraudulent listings. A report that resulted in that specific website going offline within about 2 weeks, though I have no illusion this meaningfully disrupted the broader operation, since these scam networks typically maintain multiple website templates and can spin up a new one relatively quickly once one gets taken down. I attempted a dispute through the payment app I'd used, which, as I'd feared, given how these platforms generally handle person-to-person payment disputes, offered limited recourse since the payment had been sent as what the platform classified as a personal payment between individuals rather than a purchase-protected transaction, a distinction that mattered enormously, and that I now understand is exactly why scammers in this specific category so consistently push buyers toward exactly this kind of payment method rather than a credit card or a payment platform's actual protected purchase option, which would have given me considerably stronger dispute rights. I did not, ultimately, recover my $900, which I want to be honest about rather than present a falsely tidy resolution, since the specific mechanics of this scam, an anonymous seller identity, a payment method offering minimal consumer protection, and an operation apparently sophisticated enough to be running multiple simultaneous fake breeder identities across different states, made individual financial recovery genuinely difficult to achieve through any single consumer complaint alone. What I did do, which I think mattered beyond my own individual case, was post a detailed account of exactly what happened, including the specific reverse image search findings showing the stolen photos in use across multiple fake listings in a couple of larger breed-specific enthusiast communities online, specifically to help other people searching for the same rare, expensive breed variant recognize the same pattern before losing their own deposit the way I had. I received messages from at least 5 other people within a couple of weeks describing either an identical experience with a loss similar to mine, or, more encouragingly, having recognized the specific pattern I described in a listing they'd been actively considering and backing out before sending any payment at all, which felt like a genuinely meaningful outcome even without any financial recovery of my own. I did, eventually, get my French bulldog, a real one, from an actual, verifiable breeder I found through a legitimate breed club referral system rather than an open online marketplace search, a process that took considerably longer and involved a waiting list rather than the instant gratification of an available puppy ready to ship immediately, which, in hindsight, I now recognize as itself a meaningful signal. Legitimate, reputable breeders of genuinely sought-after breeds are generally not sitting on immediately available inventory, ready to ship to the first person who sends a deposit, precisely because responsible breeding operates on a considerably slower, more deliberate timeline than any scam depending on rapid, high-volume transactions ever would. If you're searching for any specific, expensive, or hard-to-find breed online, my strongest practical advice, beyond the standard warnings about too good to be true pricing, is to run any breeder's specific listing photos through a reverse image search before ever sending a deposit, a step that takes less than 5 minutes, and that, in my case, would have immediately revealed the exact same puppies supposedly being sold under multiple different breeder identities in different states, and to specifically insist on payment methods that offer real purchase protection rather than a personal payment app transfer, since that single detail, more than any other red flag in this entire experience, was the actual mechanism that made my $900 essentially unrecoverable once it became clear no real puppy had ever existed at all. Story 7. My mother hired a home staging company to help sell her house after my father passed, and the stager convinced her to let several genuinely valuable antique pieces, a writing desk, a set of dining chairs, and a grandfather clock that had been in our family for 3 generations, be temporarily consigned to the staging company's own showroom inventory for the duration of the listing, supposedly to be swapped with more neutral, market-friendly staging furniture, and by the time the house sold 4 months later, those specific pieces had already been sold to other clients entirely, with the staging company treating my mother's furniture as their own resaleable inventory rather than items merely on loan for staging purposes. I want to explain how my mother ended up agreeing to this, because I think it's important context given the grief she was navigating at the time, rather than any particular naivety on her part under normal circumstances. She was staging the house about 5 months after my father's death, genuinely overwhelmed by the entire process of preparing to sell the home they'd lived in together for over 30 years, and the stager, a woman who presented herself warmly and with what seemed like real professional competence, suggested that several of the home's more personal, or old-fashioned pieces would photograph better and appeal to a broader range of buyers if temporarily swapped for more neutral staging furniture during the listing period. That suggestion, on its own, is a completely standard and reasonable staging practice. Swapping out personal or dated furniture for neutral pieces during a listing is something staging professionals do constantly and legitimately. Where this went wrong was in the specific structure of what my mother actually signed, a document the stager described as a standard staging agreement, but which, buried in its language, described the removed pieces as being placed on consignment with the staging company for the duration of the agreement. Language that, critically, granted the staging company authority to sell those pieces on my mother's behalf as part of their broader consignment inventory operation, rather than simply holding them in storage to be returned once the home sold. I want to be honest that my mother did not fully understand this distinction when she signed, and did not mention the specific consignment language to me at the time, since she, reasonably, understood the arrangement as her furniture being temporarily stored elsewhere during the listing period, exactly as the stager's verbal explanation had framed it, not as those specific pieces being made available for sale to other people in the meantime. I found out something was wrong only once the house actually sold, and my mother contacted the staging company to arrange retrieval of her furniture, specifically the grandfather clock, since she'd already identified where she wanted to place it in her new, smaller condo. The stager's response was, apparently, initially vague and evasive, citing some kind of processing delay, before eventually admitting, once my mother pressed directly, that the grandfather clock, along with the writing desk and dining chairs, had already been sold to other clients as part of the company's consignment furniture inventory months earlier, well before the house itself had even finished selling. I got involved once my mother called me, upset and confused, trying to understand how furniture she believed was simply being stored temporarily had instead been sold to strangers without her knowledge or consent. I want to describe going back through the actual signed staging agreement with her at that point, reading the specific consignment language for the first time myself, and feeling a very specific kind of anger at how that language had been presented. Technically included in the document she'd signed, but never once explained verbally in terms that matched what it actually authorized, verbally described as temporary storage and swap, legally structured as a consignment sale authorization. I want to note something important here that a consumer attorney later confirmed for us, which is that the mere presence of specific language in a signed contract does not automatically mean a company has acted in good faith if that language was materially misrepresented verbally at the point of signing, particularly with a client. My mother, who was demonstrably in a vulnerable emotional state dealing with recent grief and a major life transition. Factors that courts do sometimes weigh when evaluating whether a contract was entered into with genuinely informed consent versus technical signature obtained through a misleading verbal framing of the actual terms. We retained that attorney specifically to pursue recovery for the 3 specific pieces, which we had appraised, once we understood the situation, at a combined value of just under $14,000 based on their genuine antique and provenance value, considerably more than the staging company would have realized simply reselling them as generic second-hand furniture to whatever consignment clients had purchased them, since the specific family provenance and craftsmanship quality of these particular pieces gave them real value beyond an ordinary furniture resale price. Our attorney's first step was requesting the staging company's complete records regarding these 3 specific items, including whatever sale documentation existed for their resale to other clients, both to establish clearly that they had, in fact, been sold rather than simply relocated or lost, and to identify who had actually purchased them, since recovering the physical items themselves, if the actual pieces could still be identified and located, mattered enormously more to my mother than any financial settlement alone would have, given their family history and sentimental significance. The staging company's records, once obtained through this request, confirmed the grandfather clock had been sold to a private buyer roughly 2 months into the 4-month staging period, the writing desk to a different private buyer around the same time, and the dining chairs incorporated into a separate consignment sale to a third party entirely. This confirmation, while painful to receive in such concrete terms, gave us something to actually act on, rather than continuing to negotiate in the abstract. For the grandfather clock specifically, given its irreplaceable family significance, our attorney contacted the buyer directly, through information obtained from the staging company's own sale records, explaining the situation and the ongoing dispute regarding the staging company's authority to have sold the piece in the first place. That buyer, notably, once the situation was explained clearly, and given that the underlying dispute was squarely between my mother and the staging company, rather than any wrongdoing on the buyer's own part, was willing to negotiate a resolution where our family repurchased the clock back from her at a fair price reflecting what she'd originally paid, a resolution that recovered the actual specific piece, the thing that mattered most to my mother by a wide margin, though at the cost of paying to get it back on top of everything else. An outcome we accepted, specifically because of how much the clock's actual physical continuity, the same object rather than merely equivalent compensation, meant to our family. The writing desk and dining chairs, unfortunately, had been resold further along or were held by buyers less willing to negotiate a return once contacted, meaning for those two pieces we ultimately pursued financial recovery rather than physical restitution, which our attorney handled through a formal demand against the staging company itself, framed around breach of the actual bailment relationship that should have governed the arrangement, meaning furniture temporarily entrusted for a specific limited purpose, staging during a listing period, rather than any genuine consignment sale authorization that the misleading verbal presentation had never actually, honestly conveyed to my mother at signing. That demand, backed by the staging company's own sale records, confirming the specific unauthorized sales and their timing well before the listing period had even concluded, resulted in a settlement covering the appraised value of the writing desk and dining chairs, along with reimbursement for the cost of repurchasing the grandfather clock from its buyer. A resolution that made my mother financially whole for what had happened, though I want to be honest that no financial settlement fully addresses the specific violation of trust involved in someone selling a grieving widow's family heirlooms without her actual informed understanding of what she'd agreed to. We also filed a complaint with our state's Consumer Protection Division, specifically regarding the staging company's practice of using ambiguous consignment language in what was verbally presented and marketed as ordinary staging furniture storage, and separately left detailed, specific reviews describing exactly what had happened on the platforms where this staging company solicited new clients, since we felt strongly that other families, particularly other people navigating grief or major life transitions, who might be similarly inclined to trust a warm, professionally presented stager's verbal explanation over a careful, independent reading of the actual contract language, deserve to know this specific risk existed with this specific company before entrusting their own family pieces to a similar arrangement. I want to end on the practical lesson, since I think it's a genuinely useful one beyond just this specific staging company. Anytime you're asked to temporarily relinquish physical possession of a valuable or sentimental item, whether for staging, storage, consignment, repair, or any other stated temporary purpose, the actual written terms describing what authority the other party has over that item during the arrangement matter enormously more than whatever verbal explanation accompanies the signing, and it is always worth reading that specific language carefully, or having someone else read it for you if you're navigating a difficult emotional period, where careful reading feels like one more burden you don't have capacity for in the moment. Because the gap between "we'll store this for you" and "we'll hold this as consignment inventory we're authorized to sell" can be a single paragraph's difference in a contract, and, as my family learned, an entire family heirloom's difference in what actually happens to something you believed was simply being kept safe until you asked for it back. Story 8. I applied for what looked like a completely legitimate mystery shopper job, was mailed a cashier's check for $2,800, with instructions to deposit it, keep $300 as my payment, and wire the remaining $2,500 to a specific evaluation target to test their money transfer service. And I very nearly wired that money before my own bank's fraud department caught what I hadn't, that the cashier's check itself was counterfeit, meaning I would have been wiring real money out of my own account against a deposit that was going to bounce days later, leaving me responsible for the entire amount. I want to walk through exactly how convincing this looked, because I think the specific plausibility of mystery shopper scams as a category matters for understanding why so many people, including me, someone who considers myself reasonably scam-aware, still comes close to falling for one. Legitimate mystery shopping is a real industry. Companies genuinely do pay people to evaluate retail experiences, customer service interactions, and money transfer services specifically, since companies offering wire transfer or money order services do actually want to test their own process from a customer's perspective periodically, meaning the entire premise of the job I'd applied for was not inherently implausible on its face. I'd found the listing on a job board that hosts a genuine mix of real gig postings alongside, apparently, some fraudulent ones I had no way to distinguish at a glance, applied with a basic resume, and received a response within a few days from someone presenting as a coordinator for a mystery shopping company, with a professional enough-looking, if somewhat generic, company website outlining the specific assignment, evaluate a retail location's customer service, and separately, evaluate a money transfer service by actually using it to send a specific amount to a designated recipient, all documented and reported back afterward for a flat per-assignment fee. The check arrived by mail within about a week, a cashier's check, drawn on an actual, real bank for $2,800, along with detailed written instructions: deposit the check, wait for it to clear, keep $300 as my fee for both assignments, and wire the remaining $2,500 through the specific money transfer service being evaluated to a name and location provided in the instructions. Then complete a short evaluation form regarding my experience with both the retail visit and the transfer process. I deposited the check at my bank, and this is the specific detail that I think matters most for anyone reading this who might find themselves in a similar situation. My bank's teller processed the deposit normally, and my account, within a day, showed the funds as available according to my bank's standard funds availability schedule, a detail that felt, at the time, like confirmation the check was legitimate, since surely a bank wouldn't make funds available if there was a problem with the check itself. This is the part I did not understand before this happened, and that I think is the single most important piece of information in this entire story. Funds being marked as available in your account balance is not the same thing as a check having actually, fully cleared and been confirmed as legitimate by the issuing bank. Federal banking regulations require banks to make deposited funds available to customers within a specific, relatively short time frame, regardless of whether the check itself has actually been fully verified as legitimate by that point. A consumer protection rule designed to prevent banks from holding customers' money indefinitely on every single deposit, but one that scammers specifically exploit, since a counterfeit check can take considerably longer, sometimes weeks, to be definitively identified as fraudulent and reversed by the issuing bank, well after the funds have already shown as available in the depositing customer's account, and, in a huge number of cases, well after that customer has already wired real money out, based on the mistaken belief that available meant verified and final. I want to be honest that I was, in fact, within about a day of actually completing the wire transfer portion of this scheme, having already deposited the check and seen the funds marked available, planning to complete the wire that same week per the instructions provided. What stopped me was a call from my own bank's fraud prevention team, not because I'd raised any suspicion myself, but because their own internal fraud monitoring systems had flagged the specific pattern of a large check deposit followed by an immediate large outgoing wire transfer request as a combination strongly associated with exactly this category of scam, prompting a hold and a direct call before the wire could actually be processed. The representative walked me through exactly what I'd almost done, explaining that while my account showed the deposited funds as available under standard regulatory timing, the check itself was still pending final verification with the issuing bank, and that their fraud team had specific reason, based on the pattern and some additional verification steps they'd run, to believe this particular check was likely counterfeit, meaning if I'd already wired the $2,500, I would have been sending real money out of my own account. And once the counterfeit check was formally identified and reversed by the issuing bank, that entire $2,800 would be removed from my account balance, leaving me not only out the $2,500 I'd wired, but also without whatever additional portion of my own actual money I might have needed to cover the resulting negative balance once the fraudulent deposit was reversed. I want to emphasize how close this came to actually happening, since the entire scheme depends precisely on that gap between funds availability and final verification, and depends on victims not knowing that gap exists at all, believing, reasonably enough given how the banking interface presents the information, that money showing as available in your balance means the underlying check has been confirmed as real. The check, once my bank completed their own verification process directly with the issuing bank listed on the check, was confirmed as counterfeit, a fabricated check using a real bank's name and formatting, but with no actual corresponding account or authorization behind it. My bank reversed the deposit before I'd sent any actual money out, meaning my only loss in this specific instance was the time spent dealing with the situation. A genuinely fortunate outcome relative to what happens to a large number of people caught in this exact scheme who don't have a bank fraud team flag the pattern before the wire goes out. I reported the entire scheme to the Federal Trade Commission and to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, providing the original job posting, the company name and website used to recruit me, the physical check itself with its account and routing information, and the wire instructions I'd been given, specifically framing it as a mystery shopper check fraud scheme, a recognized enough category of fraud that both agencies have specific reporting pathways and ongoing enforcement interest in exactly this pattern. I also reported the job listing itself to the platform where I'd originally found it, providing the same documentation, which resulted in that specific listing being removed within about a week, though I have no illusions that this meaningfully stopped the broader operation, since these schemes typically post the same basic offer repeatedly under slightly varied company names and listing details across multiple platforms simultaneously, meaning removing one specific listing likely did very little to slow the overall scheme down in any meaningful way. I want to spend the last part of this specifically on the practical lesson, because I think it's the single most valuable, generalizable piece of information from this entire experience. If you are ever asked, for any reason, in any context, a job offer, a supposed refund, an inheritance notification, any scenario at all, to deposit a check and then wire, transfer, or send back any portion of that money before the check has definitively, fully cleared, not just showed as available in your balance, that structure alone, deposit a check, then send money back out, is close to a universal signature of this exact category of scam, regardless of how legitimate the surrounding story or documentation looks. Legitimate employers do not pay you by having you deposit an inflated check and wire back the difference. Legitimate mystery shopping assignments, when they do involve evaluating a money transfer service, structure payment entirely differently, generally reimbursing you afterward for money you've already sent using your own funds, rather than ever requiring you to first receive and forward along someone else's money as a precondition of your own payment. If you ever find yourself in this specific situation, deposited check, instructions to wire back a portion, my strongest practical advice, beyond simply recognizing the pattern itself as I've described it, is to call your own bank directly and ask specifically whether the check has been verified as legitimate with the issuing institution, not just whether the funds are showing as available in your account, since that specific question, phrased that specific way, is what actually protected me, asked on my behalf by an alert bank fraud team, rather than by my own informed skepticism, which I now wish I'd had the specific knowledge to apply myself before ever getting anywhere close to that wire transfer in the first place. Story 9. I was fully, continuously employed the entire time someone used my identity to file for over $16,000 in unemployment benefits across 2 different states, and I only found out because my actual employer received an official state notice asking them to confirm my separation from employment for a job I had never left, which is how I learned my identity had apparently been sold or traded within a fraud network, exploiting the massive surge in unemployment claim processing that overwhelmed most state systems during a period when verification standards had been loosened, specifically to get legitimate benefits out faster to people who genuinely needed them. I want to explain the specific vulnerability this exploited, because understanding it changed how I think about identity protection generally. During periods of extremely high unemployment claim volume, state unemployment systems, under enormous public and political pressure to process a massive backlog of legitimate claims quickly, in several documented instances relaxed certain verification steps that would normally catch obviously fraudulent claims, a reasonable trade-off in the moment given the genuine emergency need to get benefits to actual unemployed people quickly, but one that fraud networks specifically exploited at scale, using stolen personal information, names, social security numbers, and dates of birth obtained through the many prior large-scale data breaches that have occurred across various companies over the years, to file bulk fraudulent claims across multiple states simultaneously, banking on the reduced verification friction to get payments processed before anyone caught the discrepancy. My employer's HR department contacted me directly, confused, holding a formal state unemployment insurance notice requesting confirmation of my separation date and final wages, for a claim that had apparently already been processing for several weeks by the time this notice reached them, since the specific state involved had a policy of sending employer verification requests after initial processing began rather than before, a sequencing that, I later learned, was itself part of what allowed fraud rings to actually receive at least some payments before any employer verification step had a chance to catch the fraud. I want to describe the specific disorientation of that conversation with HR, being asked to confirm details about my own supposed unemployment claim, filed in a state I don't even live in, for a job separation that had never happened, while sitting at my actual desk, actively employed, having done nothing differently than any other normal week of my life. I immediately contacted that state's unemployment insurance fraud reporting line, which, to their credit, had a dedicated, well-publicized process for exactly this kind of identity theft claim, since by the time this happened to me, this specific fraud pattern had become common enough that most state unemployment agencies had built out reasonably functional fraud reporting and resolution pathways. A genuinely different experience, I gather from others who dealt with this earlier in the surge, than what victims faced when this fraud pattern first emerged, and state systems were considerably less prepared to handle these reports efficiently. I filed a formal identity theft affidavit with that state, providing documentation of my continuous, uninterrupted employment throughout the entire claim period, pay stubs, a formal letter from my actual employer confirming no separation had ever occurred, and a police report I filed with my local department specifically documenting the identity theft, which most state unemployment fraud units require as part of the formal dispute process. That first state's claim, once the fraud affidavit and supporting documentation were reviewed, was resolved relatively efficiently, within about 6 weeks, with the state confirming the claim as fraudulent, halting any further payments, and, critically, flagging my identity information in their system to prevent any future claims from being filed under my name without additional verification steps going forward. What I did not expect, and what made this considerably more complicated than a single state's fraud, was discovering, through a credit monitoring alert a few weeks into dealing with the first state's claim, that a second, entirely separate unemployment claim had also been filed under my identity in a different state, one I had never lived or worked in at any point in my life, suggesting the fraud network responsible had my stolen identity information available and was using it to file claims broadly across whatever states offered the easiest processing conditions at any given time, rather than targeting any specific state connected to my actual residence or work history. I had to repeat the entire fraud affidavit and documentation process with this second state independently, since unemployment fraud reporting, frustratingly, is not centralized across states in any way that allows a single report to automatically flag or halt claims in every other state simultaneously, meaning each fraudulent claim filed under my identity in a different state required its own separate, full documentation and dispute process, each with its own specific forms, its own timeline, and its own individual caseworker to communicate with. Beyond the two state unemployment agencies directly, I also needed to address the broader identity theft exposure this revealed, since if my information was being used for unemployment fraud across multiple states, it was reasonable to assume the same stolen information could be used for other forms of fraud entirely, meaning I placed a full credit freeze with all three major credit bureaus. Filed a comprehensive identity theft report through the federal government's dedicated identity theft reporting resource, which generates an official identity theft report and a personalized recovery plan specifically designed for exactly this kind of multi-front identity fraud situation, and enrolled in enhanced credit monitoring specifically watching for any new account openings or credit inquiries beyond just the unemployment fraud itself. I want to describe something that surprised me during this process, which is discovering, through the specific identity theft report process, that unemployment fraud during this particular period had reached such a significant scale nationally that several states had established specific expedited resolution pathways and dedicated fraud units specifically staffed to handle the volume, meaning my individual case, while still requiring real effort and documentation on my part, was being processed within a system that had genuinely adapted to treat this as the widespread systemic problem it actually was, rather than each individual victim needing to fight through a system still treating their case as some kind of rare, unusual anomaly. The most consequential long-term issue, beyond simply stopping the fraudulent payments themselves, turned out to be tax-related, since unemployment benefits are taxable income, and a fraudulent claim paid out under my Social Security number, even though I never received $1 of it myself, generates a tax form reporting that income as mine unless the issue is specifically corrected with the relevant state tax authority and, separately, with the federal tax agency before tax filing season arrives. I want to walk through this specific piece because it's the part of unemployment identity fraud recovery I think is least understood and most likely to catch victims off guard months after they believe the situation is fully resolved. Once each state confirmed my claims as fraudulent, I specifically requested, in writing, a corrected tax reporting form for each state, since the initial form generated when the fraudulent claim was paid would otherwise show as taxable income under my Social Security number that I never actually received and should never be taxed on. A correction process that took additional weeks beyond the initial fraud confirmation itself, requiring me to specifically follow up rather than assuming the fraud confirmation automatically triggered a corrected tax document on its own. I filed my actual tax return that year with both the correctly reported income from my real employment and a formal note, along with supporting fraud documentation addressing the fraudulent unemployment income that might otherwise appear on record with the tax authority if the corrected forms from either state hadn't fully processed by the time I filed. A step my accountant specifically recommended, given how common it apparently is for state-corrected forms to take longer to process than the federal filing deadline allows for, creating a real risk of being flagged for a discrepancy between reported income and what the tax authority's own records show, unless you proactively address it up front. Both fraudulent claims were ultimately fully resolved, confirmed as identity theft, halted, and corrected in tax reporting over a process that took just under 5 months total from my first discovery of the issue to full resolution across both states and the associated tax corrections, a genuinely significant amount of ongoing effort and periodic follow-up required on my part throughout, even with each individual agency being reasonably cooperative and having established processes for exactly this situation. I never identified who was actually responsible for the fraud itself, which I understand is fairly typical for this category of large-scale, likely organized identity theft fraud, since these operations generally use stolen information obtained from data breaches entirely disconnected from any personal relationship or grievance against the specific victim, meaning there was no individual perpetrator to pursue or confront the way there might be in a case involving someone the victim actually knows. Just an anonymous exploitation of my personal information as one data point among what was very likely thousands of stolen identities used across this same fraud pattern. If you've had your personal information exposed in any data breach, which realistically includes most adults at this point given how frequently these breaches occur across companies large and small, I'd encourage placing a credit freeze proactively before anything happens, rather than waiting for a specific incident like mine to prompt it. And I'd specifically encourage checking, periodically, whether your state offers any kind of unemployment insurance account you can proactively monitor or lock even while you're actively employed. Since several states, in response to exactly this widespread fraud pattern, have built out consumer-facing tools allowing individuals to place a protective flag on their own unemployment insurance identity, even without ever having filed a claim themselves. A genuinely useful, proactive step that would have prevented this entire 5-month ordeal if I'd known to set it up before, rather than only discovering the fraud after it had already been paid out twice under my name. Story 10. My father, 74, and driving a 12-year-old sedan he loved and maintained meticulously, got worn down over months of repeated robocalls warning that his car's warranty was about to expire. Eventually paid $2,800 for what turned out to be a worthless extended vehicle service contract from a company that closed and reopened under new names, so frequently that getting any actual claim paid, or any refund recovered, required tracing a genuinely absurd chain of shell companies before we found anyone who could even be held accountable. I want to explain something about these calls that I didn't fully appreciate until I helped my dad deal with the aftermath, which is that the phrase, "Your car's warranty is about to expire," is almost always meaningless on its face, since these calls are essentially never actually connected to your vehicle's manufacturer or your specific existing warranty status at all. They're a generic script deployed at scale to enormous numbers of phone numbers, regardless of what car, if any, the recipient actually owns, banking purely on the statistical certainty that a meaningful percentage of any large call list will happen to own an aging vehicle and feel a flicker of genuine concern when the topic comes up. My dad, after months of these calls, which apparently continued regardless of him hanging up repeatedly, and even, at one point, being told by a different caller from a seemingly unrelated company that his warranty status showed as lapsed, something he later realized was itself just another cold call using the same generic script rather than any actual reference to his real vehicle history, eventually engaged with one of these calls seriously, worn down by repetition into treating it as a legitimate opportunity to protect himself against a real and expensive risk, rather than recognizing the pattern for what it actually was. He paid $2,800 over the phone by credit card for what was described as a comprehensive extended service contract covering major mechanical repairs for 3 years or 36,000 miles, whichever came first, receiving, a couple weeks later, a mailed contract document from a company name that, notably, did not match the name used on the actual sales call, something he mentioned to me almost in passing months later, which turned out to be the first thread I pulled on once I got involved. The actual test of whether this contract meant anything came about 5 months after he purchased it, when his car developed a transmission issue requiring a repair estimated at just over $3,200, well within what should have been covered under the extended service contract he'd paid for, specifically to protect against exactly this kind of major mechanical failure. He called the number on his contract to file a claim and, after being on hold and transferred repeatedly, was told the number was no longer in service, followed by a mailed contract document address that, when I looked it up directly, turned out to correspond to what appeared to be a mail forwarding service rather than any actual operating business address. That's the point where he called me, frustrated and a little embarrassed, which I want to note is a genuinely common and understandable reaction among people caught in these schemes. A reluctance to immediately ask for help specifically because there's an internal sense of having been foolish that makes people delay reaching out even when they most need to. A dynamic I'd encourage anyone with an aging parent to actively counteract by making clear, well before anything like this ever happens, that you'd rather help immediately than have them sit with embarrassment alone. I started by pulling the actual contract document apart line by line, and found, buried in dense legal language, that the entity actually underwriting and administering the contract, distinct from the company name on the sales call and distinct again from the company name printed on the contract's letterhead, was a third, separate business entity referenced only in a small paragraph regarding claims administration. Tracing that entity through our state's business registration database, and then a couple of other states once the trail led across state lines, revealed a pattern that a consumer attorney I eventually consulted described as depressingly familiar in this specific industry, a chain of similarly named LLCs, several of which had been dissolved and reformed under slightly different names within a period of just a couple of years, each new entity apparently taking over marketing and sales for a period before folding and reforming again, a pattern that functions, whether by deliberate design or simply as a natural consequence of an industry with extremely high consumer complaint and chargeback rates, to make it genuinely difficult for any single dissatisfied customer to trace exactly who is currently responsible for honoring a contract sold under an entity name that may no longer legally exist by the time a claim actually needs to be filed. I want to be honest that this tracing process took real, sustained effort over several weeks, cross-referencing business registration filings, checking which entities had been formally dissolved versus merely inactive, and eventually identifying what appeared to be the actual currently operating successor entity still handling at least some volume of claims from contracts originally sold under the now-dissolved name my father had actually dealt with. Once I identified that likely successor entity, I filed a formal written claim directly with them, citing the specific contract number, the transmission repair estimate, and explicitly noting the corporate history connecting them, through the specific chain of entity name changes I documented, to the original selling company, along with a copy of everything I'd found in the business registration records. Their initial response denied any responsibility, claiming no relationship to the entity that had sold my father's specific contract, a denial I'd genuinely half expected, given everything the consumer attorney had told me about how this industry typically operates. That denial is what pushed us toward filing formal complaints rather than continuing to negotiate informally, and I want to walk through where we filed and why each one mattered, since I think the layered approach ended up mattering more than any single complaint on its own. We filed with our state's Attorney General Consumer Protection Division, specifically citing both the underlying misrepresentation in how the contract had been marketed, a warranty expiring, framing wildly disconnected from any actual relationship to his real vehicle's actual factory warranty status, and the entity structure making claims administration effectively impossible to pin down. We filed a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission, since these vehicle service contract robocall schemes are a large enough recognized problem that the FTC has taken enforcement action against several operators in this exact space over recent years, meaning our specific complaint had a real chance of feeding into an existing pattern of regulatory attention rather than starting entirely from scratch. And we disputed the original credit card charge directly with my father's credit card company, citing services paid for and honored extended service contract that were demonstrably never actually delivered when a legitimate claim was filed. The credit card dispute turned out to be the most immediately productive path, since credit card issuers generally have a defined dispute window, and while my father's purchase was outside the very shortest standard dispute window by a few months, his card's specific policies allowed for an extended dispute timeline in cases involving fraud or clear non-performance of a purchased service, which our documented, denied transmission claim clearly demonstrated. The card issuer, after reviewing our documentation, reversed the original charge in full, recovering my father's $2,800 directly, a resolution considerably faster and cleaner than continuing to chase the actual shell company chain toward any kind of direct settlement or claims payment. The State Attorney General complaint and the FTC complaint, separately, became part of a broader pattern of complaints that, once I searched, I found other consumers had also filed against various entities within that same chain of dissolved and reformed LLCs. Complaints that, combined, likely contributed to whatever regulatory attention this specific network of companies has received or may receive going forward. Though I want to be honest that I never got detailed confirmation of any specific enforcement outcome beyond knowing our complaint had been logged and connected to an existing pattern already under some level of regulatory review. His transmission, in the end, got repaired at his own expense, since even with the credit card refund recovering his original payment, that recovery didn't retroactively make the actual service contract honor a claim it was never going to pay regardless, meaning the $2,800 refund and the $3,200 repair cost were two entirely separate financial outcomes. One recovered, one simply absorbed as an unfortunate, unavoidable expense. What I actually did that I think mattered most going forward, beyond recovering the money, was sitting down with my dad afterward and setting up call blocking specifically targeting this category of robocall, along with registering his number, or rather confirming it was already registered, with the National Do Not Call Registry, which, I want to be honest, does very little to stop calls from operators who are already violating the law by calling in the first place, since a scam operation ignoring basic consumer protection statutes around contract administration is not exactly going to respect a do not call registry either, but which does at least provide an additional documented basis for any future regulatory complaint if the pattern continues. More importantly, we agreed on a specific, simple rule between us, that any call involving his car's warranty, any unsolicited financial offer of any kind really, gets a pause and a call to me before any payment information is ever given out over the phone. Not because I think my dad is incapable of making his own decisions, he's sharp and independent in every other respect, but because these specific schemes are deliberately engineered through sheer repetition and manufactured urgency to wear down exactly the kind of reasonable skepticism any of us would apply on a first encounter, and having one simple, agreed-upon pause built into the process before any money changes hands has been, in the time since, the single most effective thing we've done to make sure this doesn't happen again.